Okay, so
Hello, Dr.
um,
Esack. Welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today and being patient with all the technological stuff. Really excited to chat with you. I recently read your book, KLP, Quran, Liberation, and Pluralism, based on the South African apartheid. And I really wanted to get your thoughts and your experience and some of the things you may have learned from that, and really wanted to share that with the listeners today in terms of what we can learn from that experience and some of the challenges we're experiencing in the Western world. But before we go down that path, I do want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and let the listeners know a little bit about what it is that you do.
okay, it's always a difficult question because, in truth, when you are asked to introduce yourself, you, in some ways, always engage in who am I? So
Yeah.
the one is, who do I want to tell people that I am? But it's also, who am I? Anyway, I'm from South Africa, born in South Africa. My family for generations has been in South Africa. And at the young age of about 17, I went to Pakistan to a very traditional Darul Uloom in Karachi. I continue to value my experience in the Darul Uloom, although I think it's also, it was quite a traumatic period in my life. So since then, I specialized after that in Ulum al-Quran. I did a PhD in the UK and did postdoctoral work in Germany. For much of my life in South Africa, I have been an activist in different fields. Earlier on, in the earliest part of my life, and I was quite active in the liberation struggle, in the South African liberation struggle. And then subsequently, I worked extensively in the field of gender justice. And then for about more than 10 years or so, worked in the field of Islam, HIV and AIDS, and Muslims who were living with HIV. I'm also an academic. I'm a professor in the study of Islam at the University of Johannesburg, where I have been for the last 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, I taught in Germany, in Indonesia, in the Netherlands, in the United States. I may have missed a country or two, I'm sure I did, and Pakistan.
Yeah.
Anyway, so here I am.
Well, thank you again for joining me and sharing all that. Lots of experience. And I did pick up on your experience in Pakistan because my family's from Karachi, so that resonated for me too. And you talk about the trauma, but I think that also, if I'm not mistaken, kind of informed, did that experience also inform you in terms of coming back to South Africa and looking at some of the liberation struggles and looking at how traditionally Islam is being forced on people and how that was also limiting the liberation movement in South Africa? Did you kind of have that? Were you able to use that experience in some of the movements and what you were able to offer in that?
No, absolutely, except that it's not what you would think.
Yeah.
Because here I was a full-time student in a Darul Uloom, and Darul Uloom life or the program is actually very, very intense, So it's a lot of time and a lot of energy. But quite frankly, the lessons that I brought from Pakistan to South Africa did not, if it related to my Darul Uloom experience, and was a lot of things about what not to do.
Right.
My primary learnings from Pakistan came from an awareness of two things. The one was the replication of apartheid in Pakistan, very, very visibly through the way women are dealt with in Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
While I was there, even in this Darul Uloom, very, very conservative, it's a Deobandi Darul Uloom, and it's perhaps arguably one of the most prestigious Deobandi Darul Ulooms on the subcontinent. It was Jamia bin Nouriya in what is now known as Bin Nouri town. So the one was my awareness of how women were being treated. And just astonishing, you know, my experience of life under apartheid. My God, this is the same, you know. So what then, I mean, later we came to call gender apartheid. But the other not inconsequential thing was also my awareness of how dark-skinned Christians are treated in Pakistan. Mm-hmm. They normally refer to as the Punjabi Christians in contrast to the Goan Christians. So those were the major awarenesses that I brought back to South Africa.
Right.
And I started working on them in relation to Muslims and apartheid, Muslims and racism. And so that's what I brought back from Pakistan, hopefully retaining some of my theological learnings, but
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to come back to the whole apartheid movement in South Africa, but just from a historical standpoint to understand, you know, because you had the Dutch colonization there, how did the people come together? Because you obviously, you know, I've been able to read a little bit about the English colonization in India and then the freedom movement there. What inspired a freedom movement in South Africa?
Okay, so we had different kind of colonizations over the period, you know,
yep.
switching between the Dutch and the English and the Dutch and the English. And finally, in 1948, a formal white supremacist, pronounced white supremacist party came to power, the Nationalist Party. But resistance started, I think, right from the beginning of colonialism, in different forms. In different forms. And so the question, I think it's more, you know, what brought things together that led then to the final push, the last decades of the apartheid regime. So, I mean, we normally speak about the different pillars on which our country is founded. But one of the things was this whole question of international solidarity. Of international solidarity, the armed struggle inside South Africa was escalating. The international economic forces were increasingly recognized. If you can hear some funny sounds in the background, it's the thunder. Of our, it's the thunder. That's quite common, thunder and lightning. Yeah. It's very common in Johannesburg at this time of the year. So a number of different forces coalesced, but it was largely what we would describe in South Africa, the mass democratic movement, that focused on people of different political persuasions, all of them, of course, anti-apartheid, people of different religious persuasions, people of different social formations, like, say, the trade unions or the youth organizations or civic organizations, religious organizations. And so it was this bringing together of a broad coalition of people in the country, acting then in concert with the band or the exiled liberation movement, the African National Congress. And then from the 70s onwards, you know, the regime really overplayed its hand. Mm-hmm. This led, of course, to the Soweto uprisings, very famous in 1976, wherein hundreds and hundreds of school children were killed when they were protesting against the apartheid curriculum that they were facing in schools. Mm-hmm. Many of those young people went abroad, and there they went over to the African National Congress, were trained, and they came back, and there was a guerrilla war. that coincided with this mass mobilizations of different communities and formations. And it is in this framework of a liberation movement embracing different communities, different cultures, that the Muslims come in, as you know, that time as part of a religious, quote unquote, religious sector. But it was there that the Muslims in South Africa, for the first time, mobilized as Muslims. For a long time already, Muslims were active in the liberation struggle. The first political party, anti-white political party, was in fact formed by a Muslim, he was a medical doctor, although he was the grandson of manumitted, of freed slaves, Dr. Abdullah Abdurrahman. And in 1903, he actually formed the first anti-state political organization, the African People's. So Muslims have always had a history, but never as Muslims.
Right. Okay. No, that's fair. And I think what you're talking about is there was that tyranny that was predominant there that people wanted to fight against. And you drew parallels to the Exodus story in your book. And you also took passages from the Quran where you talked about, you know, there's this whole notion of us against them, whereas you were able to draw on the text and say, well, it isn't. Like, the text strongly encourages fighting against marginalization, right? And you alluded to that marginalization, whether it's with women or some of the people that were diagnosed with HIV, which we'll get to later. But it was really that coming together of the people, irrespective of their faith, but realizing that there is the one God and there is that unity there, and we can't look at each other as different. And what was that moment like when, and how long did it take to get to that point where people finally started realizing it's not us against them?
You know, Farhan, it was, it's not possible to say, you know, how long did it take? It's like asking somebody, you know, how long did it take to learn this language? Well, I'm still learning this language. But it wasn't easy. Yeah. Because the weird thing about people is we identify with other people. Like, you know, you're in a trade union together, or you and your neighbors, you complain about the same things that the municipality is doing or not doing, And then suddenly, you know, when you think, hey, you know, when it comes to a Friday or a Sunday, oh, we are different. And then one of your neighbors die and you say, oh, can we go to the church? And if it's a really, really good neighbor, wonderful neighbor, then you kind of ask, you know, can we make dua for that person? Yeah. Is it right? You know, let alone go to the person's funeral. So, I mean, she was like a wonderful and an amazing person. And then suddenly, you know, that person's whole identity becomes a question of a theological label. Right. I mean, so this absurdity of otherizing people purely on the basis of them having a different label than what you have. So people seem to live with it all the time. Right. And so what we did, I mean, from the very early 80s onward, was to address this theological question. Right. The question of, oh, so Mandela is in prison. Mandela has been there for 26 years now. I mean, eventually he was released after 27 years. So Mandela is this kind of this great figure. We sing songs about him and. But this guy, Mandela, he's not a Muslim, you know, therefore he is also Mandala. Right. He who leads astray, who leads astray, you know. So people get caught. And so what we managed to do with a lot of theological work and community work, constant mass meetings, pamphleteering, using the mimbars. I mean, believe it or not, you know, I mean, we had a significant presence among the ulama community.
Mm-hmm.
And mimbars were freely available to us to talk to the people about, this question about interreligious solidarity.
Right.
And in fact, I recently wrote an article about Desmond Tutu. So I tell a story in there, where one person came to one of our imams, Imam Hassan, Allahu yarhamu, and he told Imam Hassan, hey, you guys, meaning the ulama amongst us, you guys are so friendly and on good terms with Desmond Tutu. I'm talking about the Archbishop of Cape Town, this Nobel Prize winner, very famous all over the world.
Yeah.
Have you tried speaking to him about Islam? So Imam Hassan knew where this guy was going, that like, he's such a good person, man, if only he were a Muslim.
Yeah.
So Imam Hassan says, my brother, stop right there. Desmond Tutu is upright and righteous as he is. If he's going to be any more upright, he's going to be bent. Leave him alone as he is.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was, of course, it's also a theologically challenging question, because many Muslims, they privilege orthodoxy above orthopraxis. You must just say the right things, Farhan, I can take some liberty. So I was, in my part-time, I was also teaching in Pakistan at a school, mostly Muslims, but they were also Christians. And this was many years ago, and it looks like a silly analogy, but it is still valid.
Mm-hmm.
So I drew two cans, this cans that you find food in, or okay. So I drew two cans on the table, under these things, and I wrote on the one can. I put a label. It's a bit of a kind of coarse, but I put feces on the label of the one can, and on the other can I wrote keema, this food,
ground beef. Yeah.
Yes, ground beef. I put ground beef on it. So I said, okay, now here you have these two cans. Which one would you take? So they all, of course, said that they would prefer this can with ground beef on it. So I said, okay, fine. So let me switch the labels. So this, to somebody who knows what's inside, in the can labeled ground meat, there's actually feces in it.
Right.
And in the table and in the can, it's where it's marked, there's actually, so now that you know what's really going on, which one would you choose now? So they all said the one that's labeled feces.
Right.
I said, okay, so what do you say about a God who knows what's going on in your life, but sticks with the label?
Right. Right.
And then I used the analogy of other people who they were familiar with, who were Christians, that were all around them, and kind of just deeply, deeply human beings.
Right.
So I said, okay, so this brother Norman goes to hell, and then I used other examples of, kind of Muslims that all of us would be ashamed about.
Right.
And so anyway, so it's a very simple, but this is, and we managed to get that through to people at very many different levels, that your neighbor is your neighbor.
Right.
And that the solidarity of people engaged in injustice, that this is what the needs of our faith is.
Right.
And we presented this in different forms. I mean, there's a little kind of bit of a polemical booklet that I wrote, but Musa went to Firaun. Right. It's a collection of about 40 different polemical objections that people raised against what we were doing in South Africa, and a rejoinder to that. So we did this at a massive level. Thousands and thousands, believe it or not, of public meetings. It was it was a huge, in spite of the struggle against apartheid, of course. The
Right.
utilization of mosques, the use of, in that time, pamphlets and so on. But it was painful. It was difficult. It may have been exciting, but many of our comrades paid for their lives with it. Many were detained and traumatized, brutalized. In the jails, people were thrown alive out of helicopters over the sea. People were spit roasted, like it's a barbecue,
Right.
while burning, while other people, while the torturers were having real barbecues next to where the fire was taking place. So our country has lived through horrific times, and we're now looking at all of this is very exciting. But alhamdulillah, it was a good privilege to have been a part of that struggle.
Yeah, and I mean, thank you for sharing all that. And even in your analogy, just kind of for me to reflect on, we to your point, we often get so caught up with the label and we forget what the individual is all about, right? And I think the focus really needs to shift back to recognizing people for who they are. And in that whole experience, it was the fight against oppression, right? And what I appreciate is, even in the work you did in the book, you kept coming back to what the Quran says against oppression and forgetting about how we're interpreting who's who, right? And the labels, but it's really that fight against oppression. And to your point, even in the Exodus story with Moses and the Pharaoh, there is that part where even leaving, there's that aspect of the desert. And that's something I want to come back to when you mentioned that after all the work you guys did, there was still that newfound marginalization against women and some of the people that, whether it was like the gay rights movement or HIV diagnosed people, what was that like? Because you've made such a huge progress against the apartheid, and then all of a sudden you've got more mountains to climb when it comes to marginalization.
So the first thing, Farhan, that we learned from this Exodus paradigm, the story of Nabi Musa alayhi salam, is that people don't have to be good and righteous to deserve liberation.
Right.
So, you say, oh, look at how these people behave, these Black Lives people, they drink beer when they're on their marches. These Black Lives people matter. Look at how they dress. The women in there, by the way, it's always the women. The women is never the men, but okay. So how can we stand with them? But the people of Nabi Musa, they, by all accounts, they were people of very weak faith, even possibly even of no faith. But they were an oppressed community. I mean, as soon as they got the heck out of Egypt, they started creating this golden calf that they worshipped. Nabi Musa had hardly gone away for half an hour, and he comes back, and then, okay. So that's the first thing that we learned from this. The second thing that we learned from this is that when you take people and you are engaged in a liberation struggle, you have no guarantee that this tomorrow is that the day is going to be a perfect opposite of the night. That on the contrary, the day is murky, there is and so what do you now do? At a personal level, the first thing to recognize is that we don't engage in a struggle because we are going to attain victory.
Right.
And another part of my early life is in the Tablighi Jamaat. And in the Tablighi Jamaat, there was always something that, that we learned. And that is that that you have to do what you have to do. ये नतीजा जो है अल्लाह ताला के हाथ में है. That the consequences, the results, that's not your business. إنك لا تهدي من أحببت لكن الله يهدي من يشاء. You don't bring guidance to whom you want to. That is God's job.
Right.
So now, you know, now you ask, okay, so you guys did so much. You did so much for the liberation struggle. And now new demons have emerged. And many of the demons that have emerged, they were your comrades of yesterday. So there is corruption. There is a whole range of other things.
Right.
So, but did you engage in a struggle because you're going to win? Or because this was a moral need, a moral, you know, there's one story that I often narrate, and I don't care whether it is true or not, but it's a very significant story for me. Most of us know the tale of Nabi Yusuf when he was abandoned in the well by his brothers, and then he was, you know, he was regarded as a slave, And then there was an elderly woman. Yeah, this is the story, okay? An elderly woman. She had a dream that God's servant, Nabi Yusuf, was going to be sold on the slave marketplace the next day. Of course, there's also the good looks reputation around Nabi Yusuf. So word had done the round about this kind of, oh, gloriously handsome, you know, on the market. And then this woman was seen going to the market with a small bale of wool in her hand. And somebody asked her, where are you off to? And she said, she's going off to the slave market. What are you going to be doing there? She said, oh, I had a dream that God's servant was going to be sold, and I'm going to make a bid for him. So so they mocked you and this bale of wool. And she said that, look, on the day of judgment, let it not be said that I did not do what is within my capacity to bind and liberate him. So this is the challenge that we have, you know. So then we don't become impressed or depressed by the outcomes. We know that our lives is just one of continuous struggles.
Right.
But the one other thing that was in some ways latent in your question is new oppressions that we that may lie buried, that we weren't aware of. And this includes, I mean, well, we were, when our country's liberation, when we fought our new constitution. I mean, the one amazing thing about South Africa's new constitution is that it may sound long-winded, but it actually lays down, it names all the forms of discrimination that will not be allowed in the new South Africa.
Right.
And one of those forms of discrimination is on the basis of discrimination on the basis of, say, heterosexuality or same-sex sexuality, or on the basis of race or religion and language. So, so many of those it's fascinating, I think, because initially, you know, it appeared as if our country's struggle was one for racial justice. But in the way in which we fought the struggle, we incorporated all of these elements into it. So when we created the new South Africa, disability as a human right, and this, by this, nearly 30 years ago, you know, so so there was cognizance of the humanity and the rights of communities that didn't have their rights clearly articulated at that time. Of course, it's challenging, you know, it's challenging because many communities, when doors of freedom open, they're happy to go in. But for God's sake, please close the door behind me. I don't want anybody else to come in. So wait, this door is a door of freedom.
Right.
And I'm sorry, you may not like the color or the race or the gender or the sexuality of the person behind you. And besides, when we let the Muslims in, don't think there weren't any of them among the Muslims also. But
Right.
Muslims like to imagine, no, the sinful people, it's non-us. Not only Muslims, by the way, many others. Let me not exceptionalize the Muslims. So yeah, but it's fascinating. The country has held together all of these things. Religious communities. We don't have, the word secularism, it doesn't feature in South African politics at all. So there's a lot of respect for religion and religious communities. All state occasions also open with religious du'as and at least from 3 different religions.
Yeah.
Yeah, but still there's poverty, there's different kinds of marginalizations, there's environmental justice, newer and newer challenges that often we weren't aware of. Yeah.
Right. No, thank you for building on that. And I guess, what stuck out to me in that story with the lady who was going to the slave market too, I just want to circle back on that and come back to kind of the reason why I wanted to chat with you too is right now, myself included, a lot of us are stuck in what can I do to make a change, right? And there's opportunity all around us. And we can question ourselves that did I do everything possible within my means? And there is this huge divide right now. There's polarity, there's complaint around, especially in the Western world, like with the government, with some of the things that are happening. And we all have a responsibility to take. And if we truly believe that things aren't going right, we can all do something within our means rather than just complaining and pointing the finger. What can you advise people like myself and some of the stuff you're hearing in terms of all the divide we have from your own experience that we can learn from and use moving forward?
Farhan, the most important thing, I think, it is to remain committed to a life of activism. And at the same time, in the middle of this, to recognize that we have only 24 hours in a day, that we have limitations as human beings, whatever these limitations may be, and that we have to be patient and loving towards ourselves and towards the movements that we are committed to. So this is just an awareness and a patience. I often use an expression in Afrikaans. I use it in English now. It sounds cuter in Afrikaans. The road is long. The road is long. Victory in our lives is uncertain. But because the road is long, we need to ensure that we have food for the road. Mm-hmm. So you don't deplete yourself. Look, you can only be there for somebody else, or for a movement, or for a cause, if you are. So you have to hold yourself, right, and believe in yourself, and to love yourself. So, but this must be combined with both a strategic and a personally reflexive practice. So you don't say, prophets were also persecuted. So anybody that is, you could be up to a whole lot of bull, and you end up legitimately, on the margins, people, because, because you have no way of speaking, you've got no adab, you've got no, and then you just say, oh no, it's because I speak the truth. That's why. No. So we have to think strategically. We have to think about what is the most effective. To call to the path of God with wisdom and the best form of advices. So this ability to stand back, yay, did we mess up as a movement? Hey, did I mess up in what I did today? And the ability to listen to feedback and to have our own. So it's a combination of cherishing yourself, cherishing your movement, a sense of loyalty, and this combined with an ongoing, Farid, man, you can't keep on doing this, Farid. You can't bullshit yourself like this, Farid. So it's one thing, gosh, I'm moving towards God, God will, but I also need to sit back and think about, people have this weird thing about praising always constructive criticism. And what they actually mean by that is criticism that I like. But I think any kind of criticism, bruh, if it's, I may not be able to engage you when it is destructive criticism, but bloody hell, I still have something to think about, What on earth made you see that thing in me? So a combination of a determination, to, wajahidu fillahi haqqa jihadi, to struggle, in the path of God as you have to struggle. And at the same time, ittaqullaha mastata'tum, you fear God to the extent that you can. I'm a human being, man, 24 hours in a life, I get diverted, I get into a mess, They say, in the garden of humanity, in the garden of humanity, what isn't grown is busy dying. So it's like this perpetual growth until we die. But more important, another of the things that I wrote about somewhere else is, oh gosh, I've lost my my trend of thought now. Yes.
No, that's great. And I mean, the biggest takeaway for me from that is the biggest struggle is really with the self, right? And I think that's the battle we all must fight every day is the one with the self, and try to keep ourselves accountable and focus on what we can do.
But that self, it also becomes alive in community, and in formations. So, I'm not just saying Black Lives Matter doesn't only matter to Black people. It's like, gender issues only matter to women. So we are also part of those struggles. And so how we are, and how do we become, and how do we reflect on ourselves and become better persons? All of that, it's also played out inside organizational, social formations that are engaged in a struggle against different forms of injustices.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Esack. I really appreciate you taking the time and having this conversation with me. I'm really honored that I was able to get a hold of you. Reading your book really made a huge difference for me for many reasons. But I typically give guests an opportunity to share how listeners can get a hold of them. I'll give you that opportunity if you want to share. But otherwise, thank you very much.
I'm easy. Well, I'm easy to contact. I'm not sure how easily I am to get hold of, meaning to pin down, But I'm at the University of Johannesburg. My email address is online. It's public. When you open or you try to, I'm quite a Googleable character. And I do respond. It takes me a bit of a long time sometimes to respond, but I do respond.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, man. It's a